Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. I'm your host Jacob Shorba, and today we're going to take a look at some of the players I consider to be the biggest X factors on the Jaguars team in 2023. So, first of all, let's define what an X factor is. An X factor is a player that the team's success will heavily depend upon, and in my opinion, I believe the Jaguars have several of these players. Probably about a handful, but when you consider how many starters are on the field, there's quite a few that you could look at here. And there'll even be some that just really aren't on the team yet. And it'll depend on what this team does in free agency, maybe if they make one big move, or we could also see a trade, and we've got the draft, right? So there's different things that could happen here that could really change this. And so we're going to talk about, I believe, 6 current players, 3 on each side of the ball, and then we'll have one we'll wrap up on relating to the draft. So we're going to start out here with a really obvious player. You're going to know he's on the list already. It's Trevor Lawrence. And so for him, why he's an X factor is, well, obviously because he's the quarterback, but we've seen with a lot of these rookies recently, or these young guys coming into the NFL, it really takes until their third year for them to have that big breakout. And I think this last season we saw more than flashes. There were flashes early in the year, and then he got pretty consistent later on, but I still don't think that's really too awfully close to, I guess, his final form, what we'll think of him as over the course of his career. I still think there's things that he can improve. And for me, I think the biggest thing is just having more consistent big-time performances. Like, there were games where he would throw for 100-something yards and maybe a touchdown, or he'd have 0 touchdowns, and the offense just didn't move as much as you wanted. It was okay. You'd also see where the offense would just have a string of drives where it seemed like they almost got in their own way and they were just giving up opportunities quite often. And so I want to see Lawrence be able to take the next step this next year and to be able to just kind of command the offense better. It's going to be a second year in the system. He's definitely going to be better, you would have to think. And if he does take that big leap, then I think it is very realistic to consider the Jaguars as a really similar team to what the Philadelphia Eagles were this last year. Because for that team, they added a lot of nice pieces. They surrounded Hurts with talent. They got him the really good receiver. Hurts broke out that year. He had a fantastic season. He was the MVP #1 candidate most of the year. Ended up being really the second guy in the running once everything was over. But he had a big season. He took his team from being a wild card exit against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers to going all the way to the Super Bowl. And he played good enough to where that team should have won. And I think that really just came down to the Chiefs' offense just having masterclass coaching, and then the Eagles' defense not being anywhere near what they should have been, right? And so you look at Hurts, and you just saw as a player, he took this massive step. And that's what I want to see from Trevor Lawrence. That's asking for a ton for sure, but I think he's capable of it. And right now, I do think that is the kind of step he's going to take. I just hope that if he does, it goes a little bit better than how it did for Philadelphia. Maybe it ends with a trophy, right? And not just the AFC. So that's our first X factor, obvious one on the list. Now we've got 2 more. You'll know one of them, I'm sure, as well. But we're going to move to the running back position. And we're going to talk about Travis Etienne. So there's one thing that I want to see the Jaguars do a lot to address this offseason that's probably very underrated. at this point. And if you don't agree with it, totally fine. It's not the way that an NFL offense should find all of its success for sure, but I think it would do a ton for Jacksonville. And you also look at the identity of this team since its inception, much of it has been based around the rushing attack. And so, what I want to see this next year is for Travis Etienne to have a career year. Obviously, it's comparing it to one season, right? But I want to see him be the kind of rusher that gets 1,500 yards. Maybe more than that. I think he absolutely has that talent, but the problem, we saw he was fairly inconsistent through this last year. There were games where he just could not be used. And to me, that really just came down to the run blocking. While this offensive line was very successful in pass coverage, pass protection, they struggled with run blocking. Now, I don't have them ranked as low as like what PFF does, which was 30th in the league, but I still think they're bottom half in the NFL. And obviously it wasn't Doug Pearson who did it, but Urban Meyer invested a first-round pick in a Travis Etienne. I think that was still a good selection, and you could say that Trent Baalke did that as well, because Trent Baalke was the general manager at the time. With that kind of investment into a running back, you need to provide him the opportunity to be the absolute best he can be. And so for this team, I think there's things that they need to do to help out Etienne, specifically with both the coaching and the players on the offensive line. I think at this point, although you could move on from Cam Robinson, you're pretty much locked in with them. I don't see them making a big move there, even though I think it makes sense. And we've talked about that before on like articles, so definitely read those if you want. But Cam Robinson, he has the upside to be a good run blocker. He's been solid at it. Jawan Taylor, if he comes back, did not have a really good year with the run blocking. He was a very much, I guess, just kind of a mixed bag in the whole blocking department, because he's got this ability to be, honestly, an elite pass protector. He showed that last year. But then this season, you look at what he's done, and he was the worst run blocker at tackle when you consider how many negatively graded run blocks he had. And so that's terrible, right? But the crazy thing is that Jawan Taylor has the upside to be a really good run blocker. That was part of his draft profile when he went out. He showed it in college. He can be a mauler in that department. And so you hope you can just develop him into that. And this was just an off year. And I quite frankly think it was. But you need to see coaching help him take a step forward. And the same with Cam Robinson. Then on the interior, you've got Brandon Scherf, who is a really good guard that played down last year, and probably because he's in a new system. We want to see him take the next step this year, go back to his former success they had with Washington, and Luke Fortner in the center. Just overall, you just want to see him be a little better. He had a good rookie year, but you can always get better, right? And so that leaves us with one spot, left guard, and that's where I really think this team could look to make an addition. I think if you've got to, Ben Bartch can start. I don't think you have to go find someone in free agency, but drafting an offensive lineman that could play there to start their career at least does make a lot of sense for Jacksonville. I think it would be really nice to get in someone who's a balanced player, who can come in and really succeed as a run blocker, and also help with the pass protection. Don't let that take a step back. I think that's huge for this team. I think they could also look to bring in another tight end that they could run out in the field, use as a blocker, because I think you can upgrade over what Ingram did. So, all things to think about as far as what Etienne can be helped with. And for him, I think the biggest thing on his own that he could do, because I think he's proven that he can be a great player in the NFL, I think it's just continuing to avoid fumbles. He obviously had struggled with that a lot this last year. He had 5 fumbles on the season, but in his last 5 games, wasn't an issue. He was pretty good with protecting the ball, and so you hope that's just an issue in his essentially rookie season. So there's that. And then the coaching, like we said, other things they can do, I would get more involved as a receiver. I would definitely try to diversify what he's doing, and I would keep a heavy focus on pounding the ball through the run game. I think that's good for this team. And essentially what happens if you have Travis Etienne succeed this next season is that the Jaguars go from being this team that you look at thinking, okay, they're just going to be great through the air and they'll have an okay run game, to this team can beat you in 2 ways. We have a running back good enough to do that, and I think a running back that's good enough to lead the entire league in rushing yards. I think he can do that. I think he's absolutely good enough, especially when you consider the home run ability. So improving the running scheme and all the blockers, that's huge for this team. So Travis Etienne, definitely an important player, one that might be overlooked, but to me, he's someone I definitely want to see have a better season. I think he's very much capable of it. Next guy we're going to talk about, and the last obvious one on the offense, is Calvin Ridley. It's very simple. Are we going to get the Calvin Ridley that played in the 2020 season, that had 1,400-something yards, was the best route runner in the league, and had a really great argument to be a top 5 receiver in the NFL? Or are we going to get a Calvin Ridley that is going to struggle because he's rusty, because he hasn't been around, and he's in a completely different system? That's the big question. What are we going to get? And from everything you see, from him practicing all those clips, it looks like he's ready to go. But obviously, it might not just be an instant impact thing. And this may be something where we really see some different iterations of him over the year. Maybe people are frustrated with him early in the season because, hey, maybe he has a problem with drops when he comes back, or maybe his routes aren't as good, or he just gets lost on plays, makes mistakes, leads to interceptions. We saw that even with Christian Kirk and Zay Jones, where they may run the wrong route, and then Lawrence would throw a pick because he's expecting something else. So I could see those issues with Calvin Ridley, but this question, ultimately, you want the answer to be for him to be his old self, at least by the time you get to the playoffs. I think you give him the whole year. Got to have a little bit of grace with the guy. He hasn't been around in the NFL for quite a while now. And if he can get back to that form by the playoffs, then he's a positive X factor for this team. He's your number 1 receiver. You pair that with Kirk and Zay Jones, and then you have, hopefully, a really good running attack with Travis Etienne. Your offense is dang near unstoppable at that point. And you hope you have home field advantage too, but it's definitely going to be something we'll figure out down the road. So we'll flip over to the defensive side of the ball here. So first guy we're going to talk about, and he's the guy we talked about earlier this week because of all the trade rumors, or more so than rumors, just people wanting to bring it up again, Josh Allen. So Josh Allen, I mean, to me, it's essentially a lock that he's on this team this next year. I don't think he's getting traded. I don't think it offers Jacksonville really much of anything that's worth it unless you are dead set convinced that he is going to just have this awful season and you have to cut ties with him right now. That is the only scenario where I think they would move on, and I could not imagine them feeling that way. So, to me, there's not really a question of whether Josh Allen's going to be on this team. So, as we talked about before, he struggled for about half this season. He had a really good start, but while the team was in their downturn, where they had this big losing streak, Josh Allen also was a big part of that. Had no sacks over the course of, I believe, it was 8 games over 9 weeks because there was a bye in there. No sacks at all. Plenty of pressures. He was getting close to the quarterback. He had some impact because you could take, for example, like against Baltimore, where he forces Lamar Jackson to throw it away. They settle for a field goal. Jacksonville doesn't win without that, right? And so you have little stuff like that, but you want the sacks, you want the drive killers, and you want a lot more of it. And so there's a big question with Josh Allen right now of which version are we going to get, or are we just going to get both of them again? And I just honestly don't know what the exact answer is going to be. I think it'll be at least closer to that dominant form, but he has all the potential to do it. He finished the season strong. He was good to wrap it up. And what you're really going to need from him this next year is for him to be that dominant number 1 pass rusher, or really close to number 1 if Travon Walker has a breakout season. And you want him to probably get double-digit sacks, get back up to his rookie numbers, and you want to be able to think at the end of the season that your pass rush is a strength on this team. I think if he succeeds, it's going to open up opportunities for the other pass rushers. So that helps Travon Walker a lot. Just having 2 really good pass rushers alone is a blessing for any team because you can't just focus on one guy. So you're going to help out Travon Walker. But Arden Key, DeJuan Smoot, if they're back next year, you're going to help them out too. If Roy Robertson Harris is retained, you're going to help him out. And maybe you get in another pass rusher somewhere, free agency or the draft. And so it really helps the whole defense in that unit. And it also helps the secondary because now you're going to ease the stress on them because they don't have to hold up as long because they know the pass rush is going to get home faster. So it's a big deal. And as well, when you get quarterback hits, when you get in their head, quarterback's not going to be as accurate, and you're going to provide opportunities to your secondary. So it's just overall very beneficial for a pass rusher to be successful. And you want your number 1 guy to be that, and right now, Josh Allen is your number 1 guy. Now, what we hope long-term is for our next guy we're going to talk about, Travon Walker, to turn into that number 1. You know, you compare him to Josh Allen. Obviously, Allen is farther along in his career. He's gotten more sacks. He's been more productive. But Travon Walker was selected earlier in the draft, and his upside is a bit higher. So if you're looking at what you expect out of them both, I think as far as considering their entire career, you're expecting more from Travon Walker. And so that first year, we all understood there's probably not going to be a ton of pass rush moves he's going to use. He's not going to be elite or any of that, but we're going to see flashes. And that's what we got. And a lot of people want to say, oh, this pick was awful because he didn't produce the first year and Aiden Hutchinson should have gone number 1 overall. The reality is we knew what we were signing up for when we selected him. This was part of it. And so maybe that verdict can be delivered after this season, but Travon Walker could still be a much better pass rusher than Aiden Hutchinson. We just don't know yet. We've got to at least let the players keep playing and give Walker the chance to develop in a system. So that's a big thing for Walker this next year. Take the next step. Learn some pass rush moves. Utilize them in games. We saw him start to use a swim move, but outside of that, I never really saw much from him. Often it was just a bull rush, and he wasn't really taking advantage of his hands on offensive tackles. He could have done a lot more as a pass rusher, and the team could have done more to help him too, because they weren't putting him right on the defensive line a lot of the time. They were having him play in the 3-4 outside linebacker role, which I don't think is the perfect fit for him. I think you want to move him to the defensive line I think that's just better. And in that role, he kind of struggled. You saw he was faster when he put his hand in the dirt. He could get off the line quicker. He could really just gain leverage on players. He could blow through the offensive line. So you want to see the Jaguars also allow him to succeed. Help him with the coaching. Help him with his deployment. So that's important. That's what we want to see from him. We saw the big plays. We saw him get a sack against Washington. We saw him get an interception as well in that game. Very athletic interception. We saw him strip the ball against Tennessee. Huge part of this team winning that game. He kept us in that game. If we lost, we wouldn't have made the playoffs. So he had those big moments. And you just want to see more of those. You want to see the progression. And you want to see clearly that this guy is trending towards being a #1 pass rusher. And so that's what we're hoping for. And if him and Josh Allen are able to succeed, this pass rush will not be recognizable next year. And both players have the opportunity to do it and the potential to do it. So you got to be excited for it. If this team is looking at the pass rush as a strength heading into the postseason next year, assuming they make it, and we assume they do already anyway, I think that alone is enough for the Jaguars to go all the way. I think they could do it just off of that. Because that was really, I think you could argue, the biggest missing factor in those big games, specifically against Kansas City. So that's all important. Now we're going to get to our last guy that's currently on the roster. We're going to talk about Devin Lloyd. So Devin Lloyd, his first year, seemingly lost a lot of the time on the field. Just seemed like the NFL game was a bit too much for him. He was just struggling to keep up with what was going on. All the potential's still there. You're not really thinking, oh, he's just a complete bust at this point. Some people may feel that way, but it's okay. We forgive you. Devin Lloyd, just over this offseason, he just needs to learn the playbook better and, quite frankly, get up to speed at this point. You know, you wish he did that before last year, but he didn't. And even with that, he still had an impact. He still had like 115 tackles on the year. He was, if you looked at the stats, you would have thought he had a solid year. But it's when you dive into it that you realize it was not as impressive as what you wanted. A lot of the interceptions were just sort of lucky, or they weren't as important in games. And so with that considered, Lloyd was not as good as what the stats looked like. But you saw the flashes, and you also have to consider that the way the Jaguars deployed him didn't really make a whole lot of sense for where he was at that point and what he did in college. In college, how you considered Devin Lloyd really was mainly as a linebacker who had a ton of potential as a pass rusher. And yet this team did not utilize him as a pass rusher nearly enough. And I think this next year, they need to, at least early on in the season, simplify things, make it easy for him, tell him on plays, this is your job. He doesn't need to worry about all these players, but just say, hey, we want you to go after the quarterback. We're going to line you up on the edge. I mean, you can do that with him. Absolutely can. He is that kind of player to have that kind of versatility, but you need to make it clear what he has to do. And so, we take, for example, actually go back to his final season with the Utah Utes. He had 8 sacks in that season. If we look at snaps by position as well, go into detail on this. As far as lining up on the line, he did it quite often with them. And he was really moved around a bit on that defense, played different roles. And so I don't think you're too worried about his intelligence. I just think this is an example of needing to just slow down the game and get this guy some confidence. Because I think the confidence just really got lost in the middle of the year. And so I want to see the Jaguars be able to adapt like they did with Darius Williams late in the year and use Devin Lloyd in that kind of role. And that also allows you to use Chad Muma as well. You can rotate around your linebackers. You don't have to have them on the field 100% of the time. You've already made the selection. Devin Lloyd and Chad Muma are part of this team, and at this point, you're just trying to find the best way you can use them. And so use Lloyd for what he's good at. And as he develops and as he gains confidence, then you go back to what you were trying to do. Because at that point, I think he'll be ready to fill those roles. So for Devin Lloyd, I think he's extremely important this next year because we had a lot of issues in the middle of the field because of his confusion. And I look at like the Kansas City game specifically for that. The first one they went to, I mean, Travis Kelce was just wide open most of the game. And that's not just Lloyd, but there were a lot of plays where he just wouldn't cover him, or he just didn't know what to do. And so that doesn't only impact that, but then Oluokun has to be telling him what to do all game, and he gets limited. And so if we see Lloyd be successful this next year and be independent and know what he's doing and become more of a leader on the defense, then we'll see Oluokun have a little less stress on him. He'll be able to focus on his own craft. He'll have another great season, perhaps even better than what he did last year. And we'll just see that linebacker core really take a big shift, going from one great player and two guys who were underwhelming to being a linebacking core that's very proficient. If you make that change, I think it helps with the middle of the field, with your coverage. I think it helps with your pass rush even. And if you find a good slot corner this free agency or draft cycle, your defense is looking really, really good. So those are my thoughts on Devin Lloyd. And I apologize as well for any slurring and stuff. I'm not drunk. I don't know. I got to work on my speech. So apologize for that. But hopefully everything's clear enough. So we'll wrap this up with our last person to talk about. And this person is undecided. It's the 24th selection in the NFL draft, barring a first-round trade. Whoever this team selects in the first round, even though it's not a first overall pick like it has been the last 2 years, they're going to have some really big expectations. And there's a good chance that this player is playing in a role that was a big weakness for this team last year. I'll list, let's say, 4 positions here. And those positions are offensive lineman, specifically left guard, as in this player would just start there at least for the first year. Defensive tackle, pass rusher, really any position that does the pass rush, and slot corner. There is a really high chance that first selection is going to be to one of those spots. Very, very likely. And so that person's going to be filling in a role that we need a big upgrade at. We need big results from, or at least solid results that turn it from a weakness into hopefully a strength. So there's a good chance that this first selection, while they're not going to be as high profile as the last 2 years, they're still going to be really important and vital to this team. There's going to be big expectations on them. And so if this team was able to hit in the first round on a player, I think that's just a massive boost to a team that right now is trying to find ways to set themselves over the top. With the way the roster is right now, I think they can go back to the playoffs and make a run again. I don't think necessarily that it's a Super Bowl, but I think with the way things are, this is still a playoff team. But what you're trying to do now is both answer the questions that you had against Kansas City, find ways to approach their strengths with your own, and you also at the same time want to provide them some issues. You want to provide ways you can beat them. Calvin Ridley, for example, is one way you do that, because the Chiefs' secondary was very suspect last year. And I think in spite of them winning the Super Bowl, it quite frankly still is. And they'll be better next year. They've got a lot of young players, but I still think you could take advantage of them, especially if you got 3 really good receivers on the field. So that's one way. And on the defense, if you're able to build up a really good edge rushing group in general, like if you have a big step next year, you could be looking at different tackles on Kansas City. That could be an advantage to the Jaguars. You want to find ways that you can challenge your opponent and also answer the questions that they have. It's not just about how do we stop Travis Kelce, how do we stop Chris Jones. It's not just that. You need to make the Chiefs ask themselves those questions too. So that's important for this team. And all these players, I think, if you knew just how they perform next season, I think there's a good chance that you could guess how this team went over the course of the year. If they were successful, I think there's a very likely shot that they went all the way, or at least close to that, maybe an AFC championship game at minimum. But if you see mixed results and it's just okay, then it's probably the same result again. So these guys are going to be very important. There's a lot of these pieces on this team, and it's going to come down to coaching, and it's going to come down to just their development as players on their own for this team to be successful. So it'll be interesting. If you got your own X Factor, let me know in the comments, or just hit me up. We've got YouTube, obviously, it's where you're watching. We've got Twitter, and we've got Facebook. So lots of ways you can talk to us. Love talking football. It's obviously what we're doing now and what I like to do most days. So appreciate you watching. Thanks for your time, and go Jags.